Welcome back to the show, everybody. Today we are going to be painting up the Mad Mage of Waterdeep, or as I like to call him, the Crazy Cat Mage. For those who don't know the lore, Halasater Blackcloak basically created the Undermountain, the largest dungeon in all the realms in Dungeons & Dragons, and this particular figure does have a Halasater Blackcloak look to him without violating any trademarks. So for our Crazy Mage, we are going to start off with red, and I want a very dark, deep red color. So we are starting off with a mix of Vallejo Model color Black Red mixed with Scarlet Red, and we are just slapping that on all over the robes. If you've been watching this channel for any length of time, you know that we use the layering method here to apply our highlights, thin layers of paint, and if you remember the recent explanation of layering, we usually start with about a 1:3 paint to water ratio. However, you do have to make adjustments for that based on what you're painting. Perfect example when painting red. Reds by nature tend to be very transparent, so when you thin them, often you do not need to thin them as much as other colors. So this right here is more thin, about a 1:1, 1:2 paint to water ratio. And then for our second highlight, I'm actually using the exact same color again, Scarlet Red. The difference here is it's not thinned at all. I just have a little bit of water added so it flows nicely, but because we are using a more opaque version of it, it actually becomes more intense than the transparent version we just applied. I want to keep the robes red, rich, and dark. So before I move on to more highlights, I actually want to add contrast by working on the shadows. And for that, we are using a mix of Scarlet Red, Hex Lichen, and Black. Hex Lichen makes the red look richer, and Black adds a little bit more darkness to it. This is applied just like the highlights, except we are in the shadow areas, the undersides of all the folds. And remember, since we are using purple and black mixed in with the red, we do need to thin those colors a bit more than what we used for the straight red colors. Now that we have some extra contrast by adding some extra shade, we can return to our highlights, this time using about a 50-50 mix of Scarlet Red and Scarlet Blood. Also, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Vallejo Paint for constantly changing the names of all their paint colors just to make things much more confusing. Scarlet Red and Scarlet Blood, come on! For our final highlight, I'm mixing in some elf skin tone, and normally I would just use this on the very edges. However, I'm using it a little bit more across the figure, mainly because I actually do want to fade our red a little bit. This is the Mad Mage, and his clothes are threadbare, so have to assume they're a little bit faded. I don't want a nice, clean, bright red color. I want something that's just a little bit off. It's more appropriate for the piece. On to the cloak. Now, the real Halasater wears a robe of eyes. This guy instead has a cloak of eyes. One of the pictures I saw of Halasater had sort of a fleshy look around the eyes, so decided to try to recreate that. Starting off with black and neutral gray, that's the color of our robe, and I'm just adding a little bit of beige red to the mix, and that's going to be the start of our flesh color, and we're going to be adding more and more of that as we proceed. To highlight the robes, it was my intention just to add more of the beige red. However, that didn't give me the color that I needed. It got too washed out by all the gray and black. So to restore some of the warmth to the beige red, I added just a little bit of scarlet red, and that got me the color I needed. For the rest of the highlights, I simply added more beige red and then very small amounts of scarlet red just to keep that beige red warm and not go dull like the gray color underneath. I did about 4 or 5 highlights total, mainly because I was taking my time. Because we have an unusual mix of colors here, I wanted to proceed slowly so we get a nice, even, smooth blend, and I wasn't too sure when adding one color if it would react with the other. So in those situations, it's best to just very slowly add your colors, very small amounts, so you don't have a big shift in tone or hue on your miniatures. Off camera, I did add some shade and color to the robes using a mix of military green and black. And then for the eyes, I undercoated them with some burnt red because I wanted some bloodshot eyes, and just dotted them in with some boned white. The smaller eyes just got a drop of black for the pupil. The larger ones got a little bit of a color for an iris. And then the teeth, I literally used whatever color I had on the palette at the time. So yellow ochre, beige, just something white-ish. So now that we have the cloak painted, let's go back and paint the robes again. Yes, I decided to repaint the robes, mainly because while the red looked good, I felt that another color would look a little bit better for the theme of a ragged-looking mage that I had in my head, and blue is a lot easier to fade than red. By taking a very soft blue and mixing it with burnt umber to fade it out and a little bit of black to shade, we get a much more appropriate color. I think that works much better for the theme of the figure. So consider the painting red portion that we did in the beginning as a bonus. This is no big deal. Sometimes colors, while they came out fine, they just don't seem appropriate to the piece. So repainting over something is no big deal. And because we layered the paints, there's no thick paint underneath we have to worry about, so we can just paint right over the red and start pretty much from the beginning. This time around, we are going to go much more dull and flat with our color. I initially started to add shadow gray to the mix that I started off with. However, I already had 3 colored paints in that. I didn't want to get too complicated with the mix. So for the highlights, I started with a fresh mix, shadow gray, and then we add some burnt umber to dull that. And then for our final highlight, I could have added some white to the mixture before, but instead decided to keep the blue color a little bit more intense. So I removed the shadow gray and replaced it with steel gray for our final highlights. To complete the worn robe look, need to add a little bit of dirt to the hem, and for that, once again, we are using the burnt umber, and I usually like to apply this 2 different methods. First, a thin layer, like a wash or a glaze, and then stippling a stronger concentration over that, and then for a little bit more highlighting on the edge, doing the same thing with some beige brown. The different colors and different application methods gives us a more realistic dirty hem to the robe. Dirt tends not to be a straight universal even coat, so we want to apply it in blotches. For the skin, I am going to use the same colors that I normally use to begin with, which is Panzer Aces, Shadow's Flesh and model color beige red. However, I'm also mixing in a very tiny amount of dark sea gray. A wizard that is thousands of years old and has been living underground that whole time probably doesn't have a really good, healthy skin tone to him. So by the addition of gray, it's going to give him a slight unhealthy pallor. And that's a good way to get different, just talking about skin tones, to get different skin tones. If you want a slightly different hue, just add a very small amount of a different color, rather than trying to mix up a whole new triad. It's a good way to experiment with new tones. We are going to be highlighting twice, adding a basic skin tone both times, and I'm increasing the amount of areas that we are going to highlight here. Normally, the beige color would be more of the base coat. However, to get that old man kind of thin flesh look, I wanted some additional paleness to the skin, so we add a little bit more highlighting than normal. Now here is the fun part. To increase the kind of aged skin, the old man look, want to add a couple glazes. First, starting off with hexed lichen, this purple color, putting mainly in the recesses and also around the eyes to give a kind of the bags under the eyes look. Helps to add to the craziness. Comes our gory red glaze. I normally use this on skin tone to show a little bit of warmth, just add a little bit around the cheeks and the nose. Went to town with this color though on this figure because with age comes thinner skin. It looks a bit more translucent, so it looks much more red in spots. So but went very heavy on the nose and the cheeks, also a little bit in the recesses around the temples, ears, any place where I thought it would look good. Added a little bit of red. Last thing to finish off was the hair, and I want to show you how I screwed this up and how I fixed it. You normally want a lot of depth with your hair because it's thick. However, in this case, I wanted pure white hair on this guy. So I started off with bone white, and then I highlighted it with a mix of bone white mixed with white. And you can see it gave him a very stark hair. However, it almost looked like a cloud, or Mel Brooks wearing a Moses beard and wig. And initially I was okay with it, but I finally decided to go back. I tried a few different light washes on it before eventually using a mix of medium gray and camo black brown. And you can see putting that into the hair added more contrast. It brought the color of the hair down. Looks much more realistic. However, it still has that starkness that I was originally looking for. So you can see just by adding a little bit of wash or a little bit of a glaze, we fixed a problem rather than having to repaint it. And there we have our crazy cat mage. So a few minor hiccups, the main one being repainting the robes to blue from red, but hopefully you can see that the blue is much more in character to the piece. We can make the blue look much more faded. The red was looking a little bit too rich, so our bluish gray color much more appropriate. And because we're using the layering method, we don't have thick paint on the figure that we have to worry about. We are basically using colored water, so I could repaint it over a dozen times and it would be fine. Our end of video tip that I like to give you is that if you are doing your highlights and if you're not sure that the color is going to work properly, we'll take a few extra steps then, like I did with the robe. I added very teeny tiny amounts of our highlight colors to our gray mix because just adding a whole lot of beige red was a little bit too extreme. So I just slowly built up to it, added an extra 2 or 3 steps, and we ended up with the robe that we have now. But that is it for this one. Thanks for watching, everyone. Hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.